Hi, okay, let's make a start. Welcome to those who have just joined us to Turps today for our talk. We've got Barbara Nicholls, who is the artist who's made the work here. We've also been very kindly joined by Juan Bolivar. So it'll be an in-conversation discussion between the two of you. I imagine it'll last for around about 45 minutes, and then there'll be a time at the end for any question and answers. Once the talk is finished, probably about 4 o'clock, we can move all the chairs out of the space. So for those who haven't seen the show yet, there'll have an opportunity to do so then. This is the first show in our new space. I don't know who's been here before, but we've moved the gallery from next door into here. So we're really pleased that Barbara is the first artist to show in the new space. Barbara studied at Goldsmiths and UAL, where she received her doctorate. She's shown her work nationally and internationally, and she was recently featured in Turps magazine issue 20, so copies at the back there. Juan is an artist, writer, lecturer and curator, so we're really pleased that he's able to take part in today's discussion. And I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you all for being here today. It's a great afternoon. And thank you, Barbara, for being here and for your words. I was hoping to get here a bit earlier because I haven't seen the exhibition. I hadn't had a chance to see the exhibition. And I had this idea in my mind that I would arrive early and then just this kind of like Zen experience. I didn't realise I was walking into an open day. So I've had a few moments with the works. We've sort of began a sort of conversation, and I'm going to start with the kind of end in a funny way. So almost like I'm going to start with my initial sort of response, and then almost like which might illicit be the end, but I'm going to go back to the beginning if that makes sense. Yeah. So in my detective book, my immediate sort of notes to self were nothing touches the edges, waves of spent forces, geological cells, neither Western or Eastern, old or new. So those kind of like my immediate sort of like accident report. This is what I can see. And generally, when I kind of encounter work, I think when we all encounter work, there are also other traces that sometimes we try and kind of follow, or other references, often of a sort of cultural resonance. So sometimes you might be able to place a work in the 70s or 80s or 90s, simply because of some kind of like reference that hinges it to a cultural period. But one of the interesting things about these works is that other than the paper itself, which makes me think, okay, this paper belongs to the paper industry in the 20th century, but maybe it's possible that back in the day somebody made sheets this big, so not even the paper. There isn't anything really that I can actually, I'm looking for like a logo or a cipher or something that tells me in which period of history these have been made. So after sort of taking some initial notes, my initial reaction is of feeling slightly disorientated in that respect, sort of culturally disorientated. I know that your work has been compared, for example, to Helen Frankenthaler in the last issue of Turps, but I would be thinking, well, actually, it's more like Sam Francis really than Helen Frankenthaler. But even then, I don't think that that's where these works are coming from. I don't think that you're trying to make that connection to post-painting abstraction or those group of artists. So I think what might be interesting, what might be useful, if that's okay with you, for the benefits of people who went at our lengthy conversation on Monday night, I might just want to sort of recapitulate some things that we talked about, to just try and carve a bit of a context as to where these have come from. I mean, I don't mean to go back in the whole of your history, but maybe just certain things, and in particular the fact that you studied at a very sort of seminal period in art education and I guess art in this country, because you studied not only at Goldsmiths, but you studied at a time where the very sort of important people making a contribution to the dialogue of contemporary art. such as not just Michael Craig Martin, but John Thompson, Richard Wordsworth. I mean, I've got a whole list of people here that I wrote down, including Basil Beattie, Glenn Baxter, Yehuda Sephron.
Yes,
correct?
yes.
And I just wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about, that time when you arrived at Goldsmiths and the whole of the sort of contemporary art discourse is taking place there with these people.
Oh gosh.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to make it relevant to the work I'm making now as well. But I would say that I arrived at Goldsmiths having done a foundation course at Manchester, which is near where I'm from. And I first of all, I arrived at Manchester having had a background of makers. My family were makers, and the making was all about knitting, textile design, all the generations of handing down those skills. And there was a certain point that it was becoming sort of oppressive in my life, and I wanted to have the choice to decide my own criteria for making. And I could sort of, smell Manchester foundation course down the road, and that led me to really work from a complete beginning of wondering and experimenting and not really have anything in mind at all what I wanted to do. So it was a lot of sort of deconstruction of self and starting from the very beginning, and I think that's always kept with me. What is the beginning? Is it the beginning of time? Mm-hmm. Is it the beginning of lots of questions of where do we start from, and where do we start from to make a piece of work, and what is the support and what is the paint, and many, many questions that I arrived at Goldsmiths with. Mm-hmm. And so with a bare studio and no real teaching structure as in how to do, it was a very very intensive period of that experimentation without working to any particular school of thought. But there was a lot of different dialogue, many seminars, and it was a real sort of 3 years of listening more than anything. I was taking part by listening because I had no idea what I was doing at all. First year I was making these quite unconscious drawings that were more akin to Eva Hessen's work, and so they were sort of blob-like things, and it was helpful for me to not give anything a name, because it was sort of pinpointing things, defining things too much for me. So I wanted to keep things quite open, and it was helpful not to have a specific form or idea at that point. So I was making these sort of blobby forms in plaster that then I could put my own.
So you wanted your plaster then?
Huge
plaster,
taking
over the whole studio.
Well, taking over the whole foundry. So I could with a cast to make anything. Very physical.
Yeah.
Had no storage space, so they were sort of placed in all parts of the college. I had no idea. I was like making this stuff. Even then, I had no idea what I was doing. But then it was, I was looking at work, reading Lucy Lippard, Susan Sontag, but there was many different views of thought that was sort of this arena of this is how I see the world. And it was more like a sort of a slow burn of ingesting these ideas, as well as what am I doing, and starting to create this idea of sort of this visual language. I don't know how true that is as a visual language as a term, but I started in the second year to then paint and look at scrap metal. Even then, the scrap was interesting because I didn't know which part it was from the car. It was still an unknown. and that helped me to think about how I wanted to paint rather than get involved in the object too much.
So a big investment in the material as a way to understand the world. So rather than understand and make something, more like the material itself could offer something that you could work with, whether it's plaster or metal.
Yes, and to establish a space, the idea of a space in painting. It was, I think that's always run through my work, whatever I've been doing, whether it's been etching or working in any particular media. It's that kind of illusion of space, which when watercolour works, you get that translucency of looking into something and sort of looking through time as well as space. But also, it was...
But you weren't working using watercolours at the time?
No, that's relatively recently.
So that, okay.
Yes. I've worked all the sort of whole span of different materials that could be deemed to be called painting.
So at the time when you were in the foundry finding plaster and metal and making these things, how did those works sit with what was being discussed at the time? Given that, for example, one of the key things about Goldsmiths at the time was the way that it rewrote the curriculum to not focus on history and not focus on discipline as the critical concerns of your practice through a specific medium or discipline, but they were trying to almost like come out of categories and encounter things themselves through a kind of deconstruction of observing something. And so how did the things that you were making, how were they received at the time?
Well, it was an environment that anything's possible.
Okay.
Which was important. It wasn't we're looking at the School of Cézanne or Matisse, which was very 70s orientated in some art schools with painting departments. But discussion-wise, I didn't feel like I was. Maybe it was a common thought that didn't feel like I was part of any one way of thinking, and it was an evolving, developing, very personal language, but within that it was still looking at other work and exhibitions and having a real debate about artists of the time. So,
what kind of artists?
There's like the German 20th century painting show at the RA.
Okay.
And most of my, as well as studio, I would say I learned as much by going to exhibitions and talking about the exhibitions. So.
Because this is something that we discussed actually the other night, that
Yes.
was the way in which you interacted with it mostly was by making this little pilgrimage to see a painting or a group of paintings, whereas now we have like an abundance of very fleeting experiences.
Yes. So it was spending time with knowing what was being made at that particular point. And it was at the time also when a lot of German artists, Anselm Kiefer, Baselitz. It was the time when Turps Gallery was making these the big museum shows, and Joseph Beuys. And I remember going to see Joseph Beuys give a lecture at the V&A. Wow. And so we're really out and about a lot, and big talks at the ICA. John Thompson. He curated the British Art Show in 1985. That was influential.
Birmingham, was it in Birmingham?
Well, it went in Hayward.
Oh, yeah.
It was on tour. It went to Birmingham. It went to Birmingham. And Gravity and Grace exhibition. So it was as though we were an artist from day one. Yes. And we were having a debate. It wasn't a hierarchy of taught and being a student.
And of course this was the BA, which is quite important, that there was an attitude with students who were doing the BA. It wasn't like you were doing an MA, you were doing a BA, you were treated in a very different way. Which is one of the things that Goldsmiths tried to...
Yes, and to get many different views and often huge arguments within seminars of different ways of seeing something. And, it was
Hopefully more productive, but yeah. So yeah, we could stay in this point for much longer time, and even talk about the things that happened before, which I thought were quite interesting. How you arrived at being a goldsmith, but for the interest of our audience, we're going to sort of speed up the sort of film a little bit. Go. I sort of imagine like sort of a montage scene maybe or something, and I guess the events leading to then changing the material that you're working with from obviously previously quite physical materials to then a shift to something which is very ethereal, but also comes loaded with quite a lot of connotations and ideas of what watercolour as a medium normally associated with. So before we discuss that, maybe if you could just say something about the kind of the thinking processes or events leading up to finding watercolour as a watercolour and paper, sort of as materials that we would work with.
A few pointers in that period. Just before this time, I was working with works on wood, and in particular works on ply. And in my mind, the sheets of ply that made that wood as a surface, they were to me strata. I mean, I was always think of sort of geological time and forms and geological maps and imaginative maps, but this strata of wood were almost, they could be geological strata, but they could be sort of layers of actual history, and I would route into them. And a route is, if nobody knows what a router is, it's used by carpenters, and it's got these different size heads, and then they can make grooves through the wood. But each time, the depth that I route down into the wood was almost like going one step further back into time.
Okay.
So it was like going to these time zones, and I would route out these areas and put other colours back into these areas and sand them. And so the surface was pretty smooth. And then it went on to making these sort of jigsaw paintings where I would route out giant shapes and put the same shape back, but it didn't quite fit. I think it was the idea of figure and ground, or not quite fitting. Something was not quite fitting. So, but gradually I thought, well, it's not enough. It wasn't interesting enough to make the jigsaws out of wood. I thought I'd insert some paper, and that paper had strata. So I would put layers of the same shape, they were like paper inserts into the ground, and then on lots of things happened within about a year, and I was scaling these. I had a residency in Germany, which is a huge studio, and that gave me the opportunity to think about these paper inserts, and I mapped out. It was in the Upper Rhine area, and I mapped out cut out this sort of section of the map and projected them onto the paper. And so
a real map.
As a real map.
So this
yes,
is a real map.
Real map.
Playing with now.
Yes, and I projected them, so there were huge bits of sections of the Rhine, about 5 metres, and then I duplicated them and put small amounts of watercolour on. But some I started to put some pools, and that offered something that the wooden work was felt a bit too rigid, and because I was working with gesso, it was a bit too impenetrable. The gesso offered something at the time, as in it was almost like it was made of plaster, it was made of geology, it was made of a strata, and it solidified like lava does, and it was all interesting at a point, but I wanted to see through something that watercolour offered, and at that point I was also working with in a studio with Winsor and Newton next to the scientists, and I was learning a lot about the. I was able to work with any material, and I chose watercolour because I'd used it a little bit before, and I afforded myself the enjoyment of finding out the whole of the palette, the whole of the spectrum, and
And I want to ask you some very specific questions without sounding too much like when musicians discuss equipment and guitars.
yes,
But I do want to ask you some questions specifically about materials that you use. But before that, if you could just say something about because the way that you were describing the transition from the works, the routed works, to these, there is this sense of sort of topography or sort of some kind of sort of a map or landscape that's being explored, which actually ties in. It's almost like if these have been routed, but they've been routed through watercolor rather than the heavy.
yes.
So if you could say something more about that, kind of why the idea of topography and land and both the imagined land, but also then you have like real. You were talking about the map, a specific map in Germany.
Yes.
So something a bit more about that connection to the land.
Yes, well, walking has always been a big influence, as well as the effects of the landscape throughout that walking. And it's not an accident that I've got another studio in the Peak District the last few years. So it's absorbing the experience of landscape. So it's not the actual landscape, it's the experience of the landscape. So, and it's not just about one particular landscape. I've been walking in Patagonia and
Australia. Have you been to Australia?
Yes, worked in deserts,
Okay.
and that was very particular to that part of Australia. So these experiences, because I myself try to pin it down, thinking, what is it about the landscape? Is it about actual? I'm like a dumb geologer, as in I like looking at geological maps, but I can't fully explain them, and so sometimes it's the codes of those, the way that maps of the landscape has been recorded and documented. So there's the actual landscape of walking and absorbing that, and the memories of that as well. And to force the watercolour to have that strata, to have that edge that could be seen to be strata, So I'm very aware of what could be the geology of the paint. Is that leaping a bit too out of the way here?
It's not at all, no, because there is something about, maybe we'll talk about the materials now, but there is something about watercolour which is incredibly pure as a kind of medium, because it's almost pure pigment. It's almost like the pigment with gum arabic, and in a very sort of, even though you get these transparencies, it's actually quite a sort of concentrated medium of what a lot of paint is normally made from, and so it's almost like, for example, if you were using earth colours, which you are in some places, but they're not necessarily all earth colours, but there's that sense of almost like making the landscape with the landscape. There's that kind of
yes.
Like if you've got not quite mud. That's more literal, but using watercolours allows the poetry of what colours can do, but also still something physical about the way that pigment settles and behaves in different ways. Different pigments.
It is a bit, sometimes, with a particularly large, well, I'm a small work as well, it's almost like geology in action when I'm making them, because I have these props to the side to wedge the work, and I create these climates that I use fans and heaters and thermostats, so they are like an engineered climate. And so I know that when I direct a fan at a certain distance for a certain amount of time, it's going to produce a certain edge or a certain line, and then I, like wind blowing across a reservoir.
Yeah. So you're almost creating this ecosystem that things will then settle, and sort of mimicking what happens in the landscape, with erosion and winds
So when it's because the paper becomes undulating, so some pigments it's almost like washing down a ridge as though it was moraine, and creating a pool that I know I might leave it for 2 days, and it's going to. There's a lot of mystery involved because these huge pools on the floor of pigment. I don't know what's going on underneath that level of colour, and how it's going to evaporate over time and present itself as an image. So there is a lot of engineering involved in these. Only recently I started to use the size in the paper.
Okay.
And because this paper is sized, and I found that when I just worked with water on the paper first, then the size would make, when it dried, the size would create a mask.
Right.
And so
it's
here you can see the mask. That white line is made by underneath by just painting with water.
Okay.
And so
disturbing the size on the paper.
So this mark was made with water, and then by painting over it, the edge of that mark.
Okay, so
it's the sediment and these. I mean, I stylise them, but these blobby stones underneath, they're almost like the sediment of the grounds that are coming through to the surface. It's almost like the past coming to the present.
So it might be worth just saying something about the paper first, which is something that I've recently become really interested in, because we take paper for granted, but actually it's such an amazing medium, especially to make sort of sheets this big. Watercolour paper is usually made from cotton, sort of. But I only found out recently that I thought that it was like the fluffy white bits, but actually it's the bits inside, the yellow stamens, whatever, and those are the things that I gathered, and the cellulose is made from those little bits.
I see, okay, I didn't know.
And then you will have a size within that mixture.
Right.
Then often paper, once it's made, it's usually, sometimes it's made in a continuous sheet which gets broken, which is why there's different deckled edges.
Yes.
There's true deckle and then the false deckle. And then depending on whether it's put through drums with felt or hot drums, you'll get smooth paper or rough paper. But then the paper also gets sized, like you were saying. So there's a layer of like a kind of ostensibly a sort of glue that's on the paper. So when people use watercolour, part of the beauty is that reaction of the water, the gomara, the pigment, and the size of the paper.
Yes.
And it's interesting in the sense you've done this by actually disturbing the strata first before the watercolour.
Yes, So it's all about, it's like actually questioning what the ground is, and letting the ground, because when it's painting with water and letting it dry, I know there's an image there, even before applying colour. I just, I was like, that is very exciting to me, to paint with water and then it dries. It's like, I know there's an image here, I don't quite know where it is, and then it sort of presents itself once I put some pigment on with the wash. But these particular series is a new beginning, as in working with, I just touched upon the geological maps, and this, sometimes I paint with an area in mind, and in this situation I'm working
with this one.
Well, all of these, yes, and they're from an area in mind of Lee near Manchester, for an exhibition next year at the Turnpike, and with these geologic maps, it interested me where the shift, you could see the fault lines and how these colours shifted on the colour of the map. And I wanted the actual work to shift, as in, the work to have the effect of a fault or a sort of geologic action. And these two particular, they're made in different pieces, obviously, but I stuck the paper ajar, painted the image, and then put them back. So there is this sort of shift, this idea of a fault within the work that I want to make more of, and some of them I've torn, as in this one, and it's that's probably more engineered than this, and this is a hand tear, and it's almost like exposing part of the landscape, as in the paper within the tear, how I've torn that. So I'm working with sort of both. This is very recent, and I'm in the process of making these the fault lines go across the larger work rather than sort of down diagonally.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, this theme of land, as much as landscape, land masses and the fault lines and tectonic plates, and then how you are sometimes locating the work in your mind, so that then the result is, begins. It's a little bit like when you do something on the paper and it can't be seen. It's a bit like when it's a thought in your mind that can't be seen, but then it becomes apparent. It seems like you're thinking about places that then will make what is seen be made in a certain way. So you were talking about certain area. What was it? You're going to be doing some work.
Italy.
In Italy, yeah.
Yes.
And then that reminded me of I think the last thing that you said. We were saying about the other night, and you mentioned something about the landscape, a certain part in Germany, and you said like somebody had said it, and if you see that landscape, then you understand Joseph Beuys,
Yes,
yes. Left. So I wonder if you can then make a kind of connection between the things that we were just saying just then, and that last statement about almost like locating that that artistic idea, or that sort of feeling or thought in a particular location.
Yes, well, I suppose I have different, because I responded to different sites around. I mean, I suppose Beuys had his landscape for life. But I suppose I respond to there's a thread running through the work, but it might respond to different sites around the world, and it maybe depends on the history of that site, the geology of that site, and it's about absorbing that knowledge that might be local stories or from archives that I sort of trawl through. I've been trawling through some archives in Lee Town Hall, and some fascinating stories about how this from this flooded area, which it's sort of sifting and sorting through material that suddenly becomes relevant, and this from subsidence, from the mines, this area was flooded, and just by reading about this, it's almost like reading about my work. How the subsidence and the flooding and the recovery, the drought in the reservoirs and the engineering of the canal system and the puddling of making the canal system.
Wow.
It's trying to find that material of tuning into.
And is there a little bit of you that obviously, I don't think this would be read in any one way, but is there a little bit of you that hopes that some of those ideas are also embedded in the topography of the watercolour? Is there I mean, even if you can't be ready, there's some hope that you almost, it's almost like astral projection of these ideas into material, and that we perceive, even if we don't understand them, we perceive that.
Yes, I mean, I don't want to
yeah.
sort of have to know about Lee or have to know about Lake Mungo to but it is something that I sort of ingest and allow the work to present itself, but with lots of sort of engineering in order to make that, and it's a very hands-off approach. I mean, I don't use any brushes to make it, and it is that's quite fundamental to the work. You know, so I don't want that signature of mark making. I want through the knowledge of the certain particles are going to be lighter and float on the top of the surface, and some are going to be weightier. It's the knowledge of the property of the material.
So is it mainly almost like pools that you're applying? Like if it's not been used with a brush, is it more like flooding the paper and then adding further colour?
Yes. So the water's first, followed by I've got lots of many white dishes with each has got a colour in, and I choose a particular group of colours for the work. So I know that some in that group might fall differently on the paper to others, and there's going to be some in the group that make a secondary colour, and so there's a lot of thought behind that particular group of colours that might run through a series of works.
And it's quite scientific in some ways. I mean, the geologist. It's almost like the geologist who wants to start a new strand of geological studies rather than like follow the accepted. It's almost like you are having some kind of scientific method, but not being applied to science, but to
So it's like starting with a sort of a series of inquiry that could be seen to be scientific, and then it just breaks down because I wanted to go in a different direction. At the time I was working, when I started to work next to the scientists in Winsor and Newton, I was putting just little blobs of colour laid out with other colours over the top to see what the translucency was like, or could you see through another colour, and then I couldn't keep to the system because it presented another set of questions, but it was that the knowledge of, I mean, I didn't even know what a quinacridone was or a perilean and at the time, so it was getting to know the knowledge of the paint in order to not know, so in order to I didn't have to think about it. It was as fluid as
Is perilean a synthetic colour as well? Or I know quinacridone is a synthetic pigment.
Well, it's a lighter one, so I would have thought so.
Okay.
Yes, there's organics and inorganics.
Well, yes. I mean, it's like this is when it gets a bit kind of like sort of not technical, but there's like a whole science to how pigments have evolved, and I've always felt in a funny way that the history of the world could be seen through the history of pigments. If you look at sort of Paleolithic, cave, that palette, it would tell you what we were doing and how we interacted with the world. Then if you go to Renaissance times and so forth, you can always see how whatever is happening in the world is reflected on the pigments that are available. And things like anything that has like say,
so whether it's in a tube or not,
even if it's in a tube, So anything that has like a really unromantic name like quinacridone or sort of phthalocyanide, they're modern sort of pigments. They're sort of relatively modern, and things that are like raw sienna, it's a different time.
It's got a weight of history, isn't it? It has got a weight of history.
It's like planets, used to be called like Mars and Pluto, now they're numbers.
Yeah, there is a Mars black now, isn't there? Yes, yeah. but no, when I first thought about sienna and raw umber, I thought, gosh, I should know how to use this, just because of that that weight of history of other artists, and that is maybe we put these pressures on ourselves as artists, or cobalt blue is like, gosh, other artists that have used that, but it's trying to make it, have ownership and make it your own.
And the curious thing is that what you're doing with a kind of scientific but also not restricted method is that you're actually doing what you're creating conditions which are in fact the conditions which have often pushed the development of materials, because often materials have been invented but also almost discovered by accident. You know, like say mauve was actually discovered or invented through Henry Perkins, who was trying to create a cure for malaria. He was trying to create some kind of cure for, and then the experiment went wrong. But then what was left behind was this very intense purple sediment, which somebody thought, hang on, this is a new colour, this is a new pigment. And it revolutionised our sort of relationship to how we could create colours. And then weirdly, the dyes that were produced as that result now allow us to see cells under a microscope.
Okay,
because cell, you know, you have to dye the cell to see it, you know, otherwise it's, you know, and through that dyeing process you can see different layers or different dimensions, which is a little bit like what's happening with this.
Yes, but sometimes it's a macro and a micro, you know, so it's, because I'm painting them on the floor, this work, and I sort of got this aerial view of the work as I make it, and it can, you know, I want the, you know, the details that emerge through the watercolour to have those, but also the expanse of the space that I try and create. So there is that in my mind of the huge spaces, but also they're the result of a microscopic view with a lens.
Yes. And I think I now in my mind have a better idea now of this kind of ecosystem that you were creating, and the fans and the colours and the temperatures and that kind of thing. But I wanted to ask you a few questions, if I may, about then the work that you made. Was it in Australia where you actually placed watercolours directly into the ground?
Yes.
If you can just tell me a little bit about that.
That was in a World Heritage Site in Australia a couple of years ago, and it was a site where the earliest footprints of human footprints had been discovered. So all that history of this footprint and I mean, residences force decisions because they're, you know, it's like I'm here for a few weeks and rather than working in a space and the landscape was all around, the final few days, having heard these stories of the history of the landscape, and one in particular stood out, and it was, I mean, this is an area with these lakes. They're on the map as lakes, but they dried up 15,000 years ago. There are lots of noughts involved in this. You know, so 15,000 years ago, these lakes dried up, and vast areas. They're still on the map as lakes, and some of them are 35 miles long. One is Lake Mungo, and an indigenous guide. I mean, I was like a 5-year-old asking about history of you know, these groups as a meeting place at these sites, and I was saying, well, how was the water filtered, you know, to be able to live, you know, from these lakes, and she was saying how these sinkholes were placed in the landscape to allow the water to move through and to be filtered, and this really fascinated me, and I thought, well, it was one way of putting the water back into the landscape to make these series of what I thought were sinkholes, and I positioned them in the landscape coming out from this dry lake bed. But that was a result of responding to the landscape, having stories and experienced it, and before I went looking at maps. You know. So it's a configuration of different influences, and it enabled me to think about the sort of paper, because you come back from these experiences, and it allowed me to think about the landscape as the paper, or the paper as the landscape and locate that water within that field.
Yes, and would you say that going to this location, if you took, say, the Malevich Squares, some people might take it as their sort of year zero, would this be like your year zero a little bit? Like you go back somewhere that is, when you say, where does something begin?
Yes,
so
yes.
Within your time.
Yes, that was pretty good time writing the zeros. That was
You're not going to be able to maybe go any further
no,
back.
That's first footprints, and no, that was something else, because every footprint you took in that environment, it was pretty remote, and I thought I was never going to, I could walk out further and further, and thought, I'm never going to come back. So it was that. But that was a distillation of my time there. Just before the sinkholes, I was putting different colours, embedding them within the landscape, just different shapes, and I thought maybe they're part of the strata of what was beneath me, and that inquiry of what kind of history am I standing on and existing within.
Yes. So we've talked about the land and the landscape, and then I mentioned that this morning we'd had a drought in the flat. They cut the water off, so we had to go to Morrison's and buy water and boil it and then you mentioned that the first time we met there'd been a flood, in the studio next door, and now there was a drought, and you said, well, water is a theme. So I wonder if you could say something about that. I couldn't work out whether you were talking globally or maybe a theme within the work. So we've talked about the land, and now maybe you could say something about this idea of this pools of water, or water. What did you mean by?
Yes. Yeah. No, I suppose it is. That time in between the wet becoming dry, or the cycle of the rain and being soaked up, or a cycle. I suppose there is a cycle somewhere, and I'm interested in the extremities of that cycle. So, as an example, the line of debris left in a landscape from a flood, or the drought of the way a lake had been dried up, and the time in between all that somehow. It sounds very vague, I know, but it's something that I do think about. So the work isn't necessarily about water, but I'm very aware of the tenuous nature, but also the destructive qualities of it, and potentially tsunamis.
Yes. But these are also quite sort of esoteric ideas, and something quite old. It's also something that I don't often see discussed within, say, contemporary. Well, you do see artists dealing with the issues, with sort of ideas of globalization, for example, or the environment. But with yours, it's something that I've only seen a couple of times. And funny enough, once it was an artist who had lived in Germany for a while, and before that, similarity to somebody who, he'd come from not London. I don't remember exactly. I think, and he'd been a professional golf player, and then he went to Germany. He was a dancer, and then he went to Germany, became an artist, and had a successful career in Germany, and then came to London, and there was no context for his work in London. And he worked often with ink and watercolour, and these quite, it's hard to explain, but unlike, say, oil or acrylics, where you have to almost like, sort of like move everything. You have to
yes.
It's almost like it's a medium where you can, you can have a sort of strange connection, less of a time lapse between the thought and the sensibility of the material.
Yes.
And I keep thinking about this, and you don't have to say anything about it, but I just keep thinking about this in some kind of esoteric way that is not something that we encounter often in the contemporary art world. I mean, now we have Hilma and Plint, which make sort of like auras and hey, this sort of okay, but for many years, you know, it would have been the kind of work that people don't really accept.
Well, she didn't want it to be seen. She said it was, the world wasn't ready for it.
Yeah, and we're probably still not ready for it in a funny way, but it's funny how it gets absorbed stylistically and the ideas then become secondary, whereas the things that she was talking about were quite out there, and even in what's the name of the book, Thought Forms, you know.
I don't know that.
What's this, the writer? Thought Forms, no, the author. Annie Besant, yeah, might interest you sort of book, and again a very methodological approach towards the esoteric. So they were being quite scientific and trying to locate, harmonies within colours and what they, like so there's like a sort of colour that would be, sort of, associated with a quality, for example. So
yes. Like a Kandinsky idea. Yes, the value of a yellow or meant something.
Yeah, and all that discussion, which was associated with theosophy, Madame Blavatsky, and all these things that they, in a weird way, fueled abstract expressionism. Abstract expression, wouldn't be what it is if it hadn't been fueled by, Madame Blavatsky and theosophy. But then it got abandoned because it's a bit kind of like, maybe people are going to get scared about that. So let's just talk about the paint. And in a funny way, you seem to be connecting, Wilfield, you seem to be connected to some of those ideas that don't really exist today so much.
Not consciously, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I'll think about it.
Okay. I wonder whether this may be a good time on that note, so a good time to open up for questions, perhaps. Anybody wants to ask Barbara?
I had a question about the water you use, whether it's tap water, soft water, hard water,
gosh.
water,
It could be hot, it depends if it's the north of England, it would be soft, it's here, it's hard. I mean, I don't really, I've not got to the subtleties of, if there is a difference, probably there are.
Well, there is a shampoo, isn't there? Because I know it's beautiful.
I know.
It's really mean down here. So
Yes, you just can't wash your hands, you can't get the soap off your hands in the north. Yeah.
Have you actually used water from a lake?
No. Yes.
So,
No, that's Richard Long territory, isn't it?
yeah.
Without the mud.
To get closer.
Yes. Sorry.
Yes, sorry, I just popped it out. I'd like to know that how did you, because you worked on many materials, and then at the end you've chosen watercolor to start with, but I want to know how did you come up with this idea of, imagine that you put water first, you put water clean brushes on paper first, and then you did water in, you did the pigments in, and then to see it flows, and I'd like to know how did you come up with this idea at the beginning?
Well, probably by those, just the discs of, in a sketchbook, putting little discs down of water and allowing the colour to inhabit those discs of water, because I knew I wanted it to stay within the field of the paper.
Okay.
And then those discs became larger and the paper and larger and larger and they were, before this series, they were 2.2 metres. So I made these sort of huge discs and allowed, because by pouring in the watercolour, I know it's going to, by painting with the water first, you're demarcating an area.
Yeah.
So if I just sort of threw the watercolour along, it would just run off the edge, and I wanted it to be contained within a certain field.
So do you do sketches on a smaller scale before you do art?
No. I mean, I make small scale work, but nothing is a practice for a large one.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
Because it also like, especially the dots, it's almost like like you're going through some scientific experiment.
Yes, but maybe that's part of the work as well. It's like, well, what are these four blacks going to do together? It's all it's as it's an art. It's a creative question as much as a scientific question. What are they going to do together? These are they going to sit or swim or dry out? It's like, what are they going to do? And I need to know, and maybe that is the work in the end. So, and it is on the floor, and so it's I prop them up, and there's a lot of tension between, is that water going to burst its bank and move into the other colour, and those tensions of the landscape come into the way that I work with paint and water. I think somebody else was.
Yeah, you've answered the question.
Right.
I was thinking of oil painting as well, which I've done, and that's just pouring layers of watercolour.
Okay. I mean, sometimes it feels like working with coloured glass, is to keep the translucency and in certain areas that I want, and if I've to have that tension between keeping it and losing it, and how I'm going to create that strata and keep the space involved. Yeah.
While you're slicing through the plane, you said, was it these two that you felt they were more engineered because it's just a straight cut? Is this cut? Or
Yes, it's cut, but I painted them where they were out of sync, and then put them back into.
Comparing that process to this process of the tear.
Yes, they were too.
Successful because it's more a natural action.
Well, I'm thinking about it.
Against chance again.
Yes,
Whereas that's very, it's going to work.
Well, I don't, because I don't know what the image is going to be like when I put it
the
together.
cut itself, you kind of know what that tool's going to do, where that's down to just your view.
Yes, yeah, no, there is an element of, where is this tear going to go, and that's the.
You're not in control of it.
No.
Because it's,
No, but there's still different questions within both. So.
You said they were out of sync. Are they from the same machine?
No, they're. There's a roll of paper, and I use, and it's 152 wide, so I kind of turn it around and cut and.
You turn it as you're working also.
Well, if you can. No, I mean, when I'm working, sometimes there isn't a top and a bottom. Yes, yeah. Establish top, bottom, side once I'm working. Yeah.
What motivated you to work on this scale?
Well, I scaled up from these 2.2 metres. It was getting too familiar. I knew what the water would do, and I knew the forms that were going to come out of it, and it was. I mean, when I started, I just thought I could never stretch the watercolour to exist on that scale, and then finally it becomes too familiar, and then I was working in a larger space. Not that determined the work, but enabled me to try something in a way that I could work with this idea of a fault and have these two pieces. I didn't want to make larger work and just make it out of two pieces to make it look large. I wanted the break and the join to be integral to the work. And it so happened that I was working with this idea of faults and lines and disjunctions and interruptions.
Well, they are monumental, aren't they? I think as for watercolour, in scale.
Yes, I mean, I'm not trying to break a record or anything, but I just want that. I want to be lost, able to be disorientated and lost, and to be out of my comfort knowledge with what's achievable in a certain scale. But anyway.
I mean, obviously quite visible, so we're on this big scale, and you talked about reflecting landscapes and maps, but is there a reflection of the bodily at all, or sort of does that feel very intestinal almost?
Yes,
Sort of fluids, and it feels.
Yes.
Is there a reflection of some internal?
Not consciously, but some of the other works. They've seen sort of scan-like, as in scientific scans and internalised bodily forms, but I'm not looking for those.
No.
And I'm not looking for a recognisable image within the.
Does it feel? Do you I don't know if I'm trying to say it, makes sense, but is there a kind of a reflection of you in there in some way? I mean, unconsciously, physically, or has that not come into your...
Probably somewhere in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this was more intentionally based on this idea of sort of a coal seam hitting a fault and that disjunction, but that could be interpreted in many different theories of psychoanalytic theory, and so many different theories could be applied to it, but that was the catalyst for making that particular work, and I'm aware of other contextualizations of the work, but that wasn't my starting point.
When we get this kind of layer of images with the wetting inside, have you ever thought of using size as a mask, of having very thin size and painting, dropping that in after you've done something, and then...
I mean, using sizes, using actual size?
Something like some kind of mask, so that at the moment they tend to look as if they're, two layers.
Yes.
You say that the things look like bubbles and then the paper, right?
Yeah.
But going back in again.
I mean, building up another layer.
Well, possibly, but
yes.
Something so you're putting in what you found in the paper in a way.
Yes, I've not painted with size.
But really thin, so that you could get this, and then you could do it again.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do sort of stack that's not really layered, it's in one go, but I do, in other work, I've sort of stacked up the layers of very fine watercolour, so it does seem like a sort of a strata, more map-like.
But that one there does look like you've got two layers.
Yes, that's more sculptural, I'd say.
Yeah, but in a way, I'm just wondering, could you keep that layering process going? So
yes.
You have another layer?
Yes, I have done in the past. Yeah. But this is more about sort of one go, and I wanted them to be cruder. And less crafted, sort of layer-wise, because I don't know. But I don't.
They work perfectly well.
Yes, no, but I wanted it. Yes.
What happens if you do keep going?
Yes, yeah. No, I've yeah. I know what you say, but I haven't used the size as in to do that.
I don't know, it might not work.
Yes.
It works very well there. I wondered if you could found that.
Yes.
Can you somehow manipulate?
Yes, mask. Yeah.
But in ways where you wouldn't know what's happening.
Yes.
It's really nice where you don't know what you've done until you then apply the next level.
Yes. Yes, the lost and the found. Yeah. But thanks.
I was going to ask a similar question to previous about biomorphism. If you found that you were conflicted by elements in the painting becoming too biomorphic, and if you were aware of something looking like something else, whether you'd consciously steer it away from something looking like.
When it's something becomes to look like something recognisable, I'm not into that.
No, so would you consciously steer it away from?
Yes, when I'm making it, but I equally I accept that they can be seen as scan-like and brain-like, and and that was more in the smaller work.
It's the element of control, isn't it? If you're controlling it away from something, that's
that's the engineering.
Well,
it's the control
abstraction rather than the lack of control sometimes produces a figurative element.
Yes.
So you do consciously draw it back to abstraction. Yeah.
Definitely. Really concerns me when it starts.
Yeah, exactly.
Really concerns me.
So they do have very powerful personality. Each one has such a different, and because they're large, they're they feel like a thing. I mean, I don't know. It sounds like kind of. I feel it's more than just. They have an incredible personality. These two are so different from each other, but I kind of.
But I wanted them to be quite different. I've got, I've got there's a few in that particular series, and I could have included that and had the two, but I wanted two very different ones, and to have that kind of debate we've had, and in this space, it's a perfect space for this scale work.
How often do you get to see them on the wall? Actually, sort of visible?
Well, this size work not very often because. I can probably put one in my studio in London, that height, and then I've got the space, and they don't fit. It's got.
You roll them?
Yes, yeah.
So I wonder, how do you name those titles?
Titles are very, very difficult. Yeah, so sometimes I include the way that it's being made or related to the landscape in some very loose form. Until the last few years, I've been using a geologic dictionary of phrases, and so there's one painting I named, and it was alluvial van. But I put alluvial fan because I made it with fans, and so some of the processes are involved in the included within the geologic. But I find, because they're not figurative, and I'm not working from a narrative, I do find titles quite difficult.
Yes, because after a while you run out of the words.
Well, no, not really. No, never. No, just keep chopping them up and including the process change. And I've not torn before, and I've not had giant pools, and this is called torn pools, and just put words together.
Okay, well, wrap up.
Yeah, thank you.